This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so today we're diving into one of the most hotly debated topics in American history.
Oh, yeah.
FDR's foreign policy in the 1930s.
Right.
So picture this. You're leading a nation,
Yeah.
teetering on the brink of global conflict,
Mm-hmm.
and your people are deeply divided on how to respond.
Yeah.
Could you navigate that?
It's tough.
That's the situation we're exploring today, folks.
Yeah.
The fascinating but complex decisions of SDR.
Mm.
So was he a true isolationist at heart?
Mm.
Or a clever interventionist, just disguised by what the public wanted?
Yeah, it's a really good question, especially when you think about what was happening back then.
Right.
The 1930s, America's still reeling from the aftermath of World War I.
Right.
And the prevailing sentiment was very much America first.
Yeah.
And, a prime example of this are the Neutrality Acts.
Oh, the Neutrality Act.
Passed in the mid-1930s.
Right.
These acts really show that desire to just stay clear of all these international entanglements.
Okay, so those Neutrality Acts, those were huge. Right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Didn't they ban stuff like selling weapons to countries at war?
Yeah, exactly. They really restricted American involvement in foreign conflicts.
Okay.
And it reflected this really strong isolationist stance that a lot of people had at the time.
And it seemed like FDR's actions were backing that up too, right?
They did, and his 1936 election speech is a perfect example of that.
Right.
He flat out vowed to keep America out of foreign wars.
Wow.
He even said, "We shun political commitments which might entangle us in foreign wars."
So it definitely sounds like he was playing to the isolationist crowd there.
Oh, for sure.
And he did eventually sign those Neutrality Acts into law.
He did. He did.
Okay, so then what about the Spanish Civil War?
Yeah, that's another really interesting case.
Okay.
You've got these fascist forces
Right.
backed by Hitler and Mussolini fighting against the democratically elected Republican government.
Right.
It was brutal.
Yeah.
And while, FDR might have personally sympathized with the Republicans,
Yeah,
he stuck to the Neutrality Act.
they did.
Kept America out of the fight.
So looking at all of this,
Yeah.
it's easy to see why some historians view FDR as a true isolationist.
Yeah, you can definitely see that side of it, but
But-
there are some counter-arguments.
Okay.
And this is where things take a bit of a turn.
Okay.
For example, even with the Neutrality Acts in place,
Right.
FDR still made some pretty specific choices.
Interesting.
Like take the 1936 extension of the Neutrality Act.
Right.
It barred loans to nations at war,
Right.
but only new loans.
Right.
Existing debts could still be restructured.
Huh.
This gave countries like Britain some financial breathing room.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a little detail that I think sometimes gets overlooked.
It sounds like he was finding loopholes to help without actually breaking those neutrality rules.
Exactly.
Sneaky, sneaky.
And then there's what happened with Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and Hitler remilitarizing the Rhineland.
Right. Major events.
Huge violations of international agreements.
Yeah.
But the U.S., under FDR, stayed officially neutral.
But I have a feeling you're about to say but.
Haha, yeah, you got me.
Okay.
Because while the U.S. didn't jump into any direct military action,
Okay.
FDR did condemn those actions pretty strongly.
Oh, really?
He even called for moral embargoes against those aggressors.
Interesting.
It might seem kind of insignificant at first glance,
Yeah.
but it does indicate that he wasn't totally passive.
Right.
He was using diplomatic pressure, trying to rally international opinion against these aggressive moves.
So he's walking a tightrope here.
Yeah.
Between staying neutral,
Mm-hmm.
but also taking a stand against what he obviously sees as wrong.
Right.
What I'm hearing is, even during this supposedly isolationist period,
Yeah.
FDR was already showing signs of a more hands-on approach to foreign policy.
You're picking up on it.
Maybe.
And that leads us to a crucial moment.
Okay.
FDR's 1937 quarantine speech.
The quarantine speech. Okay.
This was a very carefully crafted address
Right.
delivered in the middle of all this rising international tension.
Yeah, things are heating up.
Good.
Okay, so what did he say?
He called for a quarantine against these aggressor nations.
Quarantine.
Yeah, suggesting that America couldn't just sit back and ignore the rise of fascism.
So how did the public react to this?
Oh, it definitely stirred up some debate.
Really?
Some people saw it as a clear sign that FDR was moving away from that strict isolationism.
Okay.
Others, though,
Yeah.
they argued that it was all talk and no action, saying he didn't actually propose any concrete steps.
Right.
And the speech itself was pretty vague on how this quarantine would actually work.
So historians are still arguing about what the quarantine speech really meant.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Was this like a real change in FDR's thinking, or was it a calculated move to test the waters of public opinion?
It's a fascinating question.
It is.
And there's no simple answer.
Right.
We'll need to dig a little deeper into the context
Yeah.
and what happened next.
Yeah, because context is everything.
It really is. You know what's really interesting here?
What's that caught?
Even as historians are debating the real meaning of that speech.
The quarantine speech.
Yeah.
Okay.
FDR's actions start to get really hard to call purely isolationist.
Yeah, you can't just focus on the words. Right?
Exactly.
You got to look at what he actually did.
You got it. And this is where we see things shift.
Sure.
From just talk to actual concrete action.
Give me an example.
Okay, so take the cash and carry policy.
Oh, yeah, cash and carry.
He championed that in 1939.
Okay, refresh my memory on that one.
Sure.
It had something to do with selling weapons, right?
Yeah, it basically let the U.S. sell arms to countries like Britain and France,
Okay.
but with some pretty strict conditions.
What were they?
They had to pay in cash
Okay.
and transport the goods themselves.
So no American ships or personnel involved.
Nope, keeping it at arm's length.
So basically helping out but not getting directly involved.
Yeah, trying to walk that fine line.
It sounds tricky.
It was, and it's a pattern we see over and over again.
Like what?
The destroyer for bases deal in 1940 is another good one.
Oh, right, the destroyers.
FDR traded 50 American destroyers to Britain.
Wow, 50.
They were old but still worked.
Okay.
And in exchange, the U.S. got access to British bases in the Atlantic.
Interesting, so a trade.
Yeah, it was a major move, provided a lot of help to Britain,
Okay.
but also strengthened American defenses at the same time.
So a win-win.
You could say that
But it was still technically neutral, right?
legally,
Yeah.
but actions like this show that FDR was more and more willing to kind of push the boundaries of neutrality,
Interesting.
to support those fighting against the Axis.
So he's testing the waters,
Yeah.
maybe even kind of guiding public opinion along with these actions.
It's possible, but he still had to tread carefully.
Of course.
Remember, isolationist sentiment was still really strong back home.
Oh, yeah, good point.
And then you have what's probably the biggest turning point,
What's that?
the Lend-Lease Act of 1941.
Lend-Lease.
This act basically threw any pretense of neutrality out the window.
Wow.
It allowed the U.S. to give tons of military aid to any country that was considered vital to the defense of the United States.
And that's where that famous phrase, arsenal of democracy, comes from, right?
Exactly.
What a powerful phrase.
It really captured the essence of what Lend-Lease was all about.
Yeah.
America was supplying the Allied war effort.
Becoming the arsenal,
Right.
even though we weren't officially at war yet.
That's right.
It's such a huge shift from where we started.
It really is.
From shunning political commitments to arsenal of democracy in just a few years.
Amazing.
It really is. So
Right.
what does that tell us about FDR as a leader?
I think it shows how pragmatic he was
Pragmatic.
and his ability to adapt to changing
the circumstances.
Yeah, things were changing rapidly.
For sure. He understood the need to prepare the nation for a conflict that seemed like it was going to happen no matter what.
It was looming on the horizon,
Definitely. Even
Yeah.
if that meant going against public opinion.
risking political backlash.
So he was maneuvering carefully,
Yep.
taking calculated risks, and ultimately shaping how America saw its role in the world.
Right, and all while facing pressure from both sides.
Both sides meaning,
The isolationists and the interventionists.
oh wow, caught in the middle.
Totally. And it's important to remember that historians are still debating this.
Debating what?
To what extent FDR was intentionally leading public opinion?
Versus reacting to events.
Exactly. Some argue he was a master strategist, carefully manipulating everything to get what he wanted.
Like how some historians see the Greer incident.
Yes, the Greer incident.
Okay, remind me about that one.
That was when a U.S. destroyer
Okay.
had a run-in with a German U-boat
Okay, right, what was this?
in 1941.
Okay.
And FDR told the public it was an unprovoked attack,
Okay.
which of course stoked anti-German sentiment
Yeah.
and helped him get support for a stronger U.S. role in the Atlantic.
Okay.
But later evidence showed that the encounter was more complicated than that.
Oh, really? So not so clear-cut.
Not really, and some people think FDR might have stretched the truth.
To get what he wanted.
Yeah, to gain public support for his policies.
So a calculated move,
Potentially.
even if it meant kind of bending the truth a little.
Yeah, some might say that.
It definitely adds another layer to this idea of FDR playing the long game.
It does, and it raises some interesting questions about leadership and propaganda.
Yeah, big questions.
And the balance between national security and being transparent with the public.
Definitely something to think about.
But even with all these controversies,
Yeah.
it's clear that FDR's actions in those years before America entered the war
Right.
were way more complex than just calling him an isolationist.
So we've seen how he navigated public opinion, pushed the limits,
Yep.
and ultimately made choices that had a massive impact
Huge impact.
on America's place in the world.
And the course of history.
No small feat.
Not at all.
So where does this leave us?
That's the question, isn't it?
It,
How do we make sense of these seemingly contradictory parts of FDR's foreign policy?
I guess it really seems like you can't just stick a label on FDR and call him strictly isolationist or interventionist.
It's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, he was operating in a world that was changing constantly.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Public pressure, this huge global threat looming over everything.
Exactly. And I think that's what we have to remember.
That historical figures.
Especially leaders dealing with these huge decisions.
Right.
They rarely fit neatly into these categories.
Makes sense.
It's more about understanding everything they were dealing with.
Right. The forces at play.
And how their actions change things.
And for FDR, one of those huge things was
Yeah.
a nation still traumatized by World War I.
Absolutely.
That America First feeling was everywhere.
It was a big part of the national conversation.
And he had to balance that with,
The rising threat of fascism.
yeah, a delicate balancing act.
A real tightrope walk.
It sounds like it.
On one hand, he had to keep the public on his side.
Right.
Couldn't be seen as pushing for war.
That's right.
But on the other hand, he saw the danger of the Axis powers.
Mm.
He felt like he had to do something.
Yeah.
Even if it meant taking risks and pushing those boundaries we talked about.
So he was both a politician
Yep.
and a leader with a vision for America's role in the world.
And those two things didn't always line up.
Not an easy position to be in.
Nope. And that's why the debate among historians is so interesting.
Yeah. Why are they still debating?
Well, was he playing chess the whole time?
Outmaneuvering everyone to reach his goals?
Or was he more reacting to what was happening?
Trying to guide the country in the right direction.
That's the million-dollar question.
It really is.
And the answer might be a bit of both.
Right. It's rarely black and white.
Exactly.
I mean, he clearly knew how to influence public opinion, like we talked about with the Greer incident. But he was also dealing with a world that was changing so fast.
It was a whirlwind.
His choices were probably a mix of things.
Yeah, a mix of.
Conviction, political calculation, and that sense of urgency.
With the world on the brink of war.
What we can say for sure is FDR's leadership during this time was complex and multifaceted.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And it had consequences.
Absolutely.
His choices shaped America.
Yeah.
And really the whole world.
No doubt about it.
It makes you think about what it means to be a leader.
It really does.
Especially in a crisis.
Yeah.
How do you balance everything that's pulling you in different directions?
It's tough.
And how do you make those really tough calls when so much is at stake?
Those are questions that go way beyond just FDR.
Yeah. They apply to leaders today.
And leaders in the future.
It's fascinating how studying someone like FDR can give us a glimpse into these dilemmas.
It really highlights the challenges of leadership.
The complexity of decision-making.
And that huge weight of responsibility.
Of shaping the course of a nation.
It's a lot to carry.
So for our listeners who are now thinking about all of this, what's something they can chew on that builds on what we've covered today?
How about this?
Okay.
Knowing what we know now about the rise of fascism and World War II,
Right.
how should we judge FDR's actions?
Interesting question.
Was he too hesitant in those early years?
Or did that careful approach actually get America ready for what was to come?
It's something to ponder.
It really is, and it forces us to consider
Yeah.
the tough choices that leaders have to make and the impact those choices can have down the line.
Exactly.
It reminds us that history isn't just about judging the past.
Nope.
It's about learning from it
Absolutely.
and using those lessons to face the challenges we have today.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into FDR's fascinating and complex foreign policy.
It's a topic that keeps people talking.
It does.
And offers some really valuable insights into leadership. The challenges of navigating a world that can change in an instant.
Yeah, the world can be unpredictable.
Absolutely.
And the legacy of one of America's most impactful presidents.
That's FDR for you.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.